There's a man in his late 50s spending every weekend in a garage, covered in grease, pouring thousands of dollars into a car that objectively isn't worth it. His wife doesn't fully understand it.
His kids think it's an obsession, but he can't stop. And the truth is, he's not alone. And this has almost nothing to do with cars. Generation X, the people born roughly between 1965 and 1980, has produced some of the most passionate, devoted, and emotionally driven car enthusiasts on the planet. Not collectors chasing investment value, not influencers chasing clout.
People who feel something when they turn a key, hear an engine fire up, or smell old leather and motor oil. And psychology has a very specific explanation for why that is. To understand it, you have to go back, way back, to being 14 years old, sitting in the back seat of your dad's car, or watching an older sibling wash their first vehicle in the driveway on a Saturday morning. Your brain at that age is doing something remarkable. It is forming what neuroscientists call episodic memories with unusually high emotional intensity. The adolescent brain is flooded with dopamine, noradrenaline, and serotonin in ways it will never quite replicate again. Every experience during those years gets stamped with a kind of emotional permanence that adult experiences simply don't carry. For Gen X, those peak emotional years happen to collide with one of the most visually and culturally rich eras in automotive history. The late 70s and 80s were alive with iconic machines, the Fox-body Mustang, the third-generation Camaro, the Toyota Supra, the Pontiac Firebird. These weren't just cars. They were everywhere. In movies, on posters, on television, racing through music videos. A generation came of age surrounded by this imagery at the exact neurological moment when impressions last forever. That is not a coincidence. That is a psychological blueprint being written in real time. There is a concept in psychology called the reminiscence bump. Research consistently shows that people remember events from their adolescence and early adulthood more vividly and more emotionally than events from any other period in their life. When you ask a 60-year-old about their most meaningful memories, they almost always reach back to ages 15 through 25. For Gen X, a huge portion of those peak memories involve cars. First road trips, first dates, first moments of genuine independence. The car was the physical vessel carrying all of it. This is why restoring a 1987 Mustang isn't really about the Mustang. It's about trying to physically reconstruct a feeling. It's about touching something real and tangible that belongs to a time when life felt wide open. Psychologists call this object-evoked nostalgia, and it is one of the most powerful emotional forces in human behavior. The object doesn't just remind you of the memory, it pulls you back into the emotional state of that memory. It makes you feel, however briefly, like that version of yourself still exists. Now, here's where it gets personal for Gen X specifically. This generation grew up with a uniquely complicated relationship with identity and belonging. They were sandwiched. Boomers ahead of them dominated culture, conversation, and resources for decades. Millennials came after them and almost immediately became the obsession of every marketer, sociologist, and think piece writer on the internet. Gen X was famously labeled the forgotten generation, the latchkey kids. The ones who came home to empty houses, raised themselves, and were told explicitly and implicitly that their voice didn't matter that much. When you grow up feeling overlooked, you develop your own language of identity. And for millions of Gen X men and women, that language was automotive. Your car told the world who you were when the world wasn't particularly interested in asking. The car you drove, modified, cleaned obsessively, or talked about endlessly in parking lots after school, that was your statement. Your personality made metal and horsepower. Social psychologists have documented extensively how material objects become extensions of the self. It's called the extended self theory, first developed by consumer psychologist Russell Belk in 1988. The premise is straightforward. We use our possessions to define, protect, and express who we are. For Gen X, this wasn't a passive process. It was survival. In the absence of a culture that celebrated them, they built their own, and it had 4 wheels and an engine. Think about the specific way Gen X car culture operated. It wasn't organized from the top down by corporations or algorithms. It was grassroots, physical, and community-driven.
meetups in parking lots.
Handwritten flyers for local car shows, knowledge passed from one person to another in driveways and garages. There were no YouTube tutorials, no Instagram builds. You learned from people.
You earned respect by showing up, knowing your stuff, and putting in real work. That culture rewarded authenticity, skill, and dedication. 3 things Gen X was starving for in a broader world that kept ignoring them. This is also why Gen X car enthusiasts tend to have a particular disdain for anything that feels artificial or performative in car culture today. They're not being elitist for the sake of it. They're protecting something that once gave them genuine identity and community when very little else did. The psychological stakes are high because they always were.
There is another layer here that most people miss completely. Gen X came of age during a period of enormous economic and social anxiety. The Cold War was still a living reality for much of their childhood.
Nuclear fear was embedded in popular culture. Family structures were fracturing. Divorce rates peaked during the years Gen X was growing up.
Many of them lacked stability at home, in the world, and in the future as they saw it. Into all of that instability, the car offered something profoundly comforting: control. You could not control geopolitics. You could not fix your parents' marriage. You could not make the world feel safe. But you could tune that carburetor. You could diagnose that misfire. You could take something broken and make it run perfectly.
The psychological reward of mechanical mastery for a generation raised in chaos is almost impossible to overstate. The garage became a sanctuary, a place where problems had solutions, where effort produced results, and where you were completely in charge of the outcome. Psychologists who study intrinsic motivation describe this experience as autonomy combined with competence, and together they produce some of the deepest and most sustained satisfaction a human being can feel. For Gen X, the car was often the first arena in life where they got to experience both at the same time. Of course, that bond never broke. It's worth noting that this isn't exclusively a male phenomenon, though culture has historically framed it that way. Gen X women who grew up loving cars faced an additional layer of psychological complexity, passion that was frequently dismissed, minimized, or treated as unusual. The ones who stayed in the culture anyway did so with a fierce sense of ownership over their identity that, if anything, made the connection even stronger. And now these people are in their 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Some have the disposable income to finally buy the car they dreamed about at 16. Others are restoring vehicles they've owned for 30 years. Many are passing the obsession to their own children, almost like handing over a piece of their psychological core and hoping it takes root. The multi-generational car show, where a 55-year-old stands next to their adult child next to a car they rebuilt together, is not just a hobby. It is a psychological handoff. It is saying, this is what I am made of, and I want you to carry some of it. What Gen X car culture really reveals, when you examine it through a psychological lens, is something deeply human. We're all looking for the same things: belonging, mastery, identity, a place where we feel fully ourselves. Most generations find those things in multiple channels. Gen X, often by necessity, concentrated a tremendous amount of that need into one place. And that is why the man in the garage at 58, covered in grease, working on a car that nobody else thinks is worth the effort, is doing something that makes complete psychological sense. He isn't stuck in the past. He is holding on to the version of himself that first learned he was capable of something. And that is worth every dollar, every scraped knuckle, and every late night under a flickering shop light. The car was never just the car. It was the proof.